Welcome. We're glad you have joined us today for this webinar, Collaboration Creates Capacity, Supporting Shared Pathways to Digital Accessibility Maturity. This webinar is made available by the Northwest Higher Education Accessibility Technology Group. Northwest HEAT is a joint project of the Orbis Cascade Alliance and NWAC, the Northwest Academic Computing Consortium. Our mission is to advance our common goal of ensuring that digital services, systems, and resources are equitably accessible to all users. Our overarching goal is to cultivate a community of practice among faculty and staff who support digital accessibility on their campuses. To do this, we provide a series of professional development opportunities, such as this webinar, and we share best practices and resources through a collaborative knowledge base. If you'd like more information about the work of Northwest HEAT and how you can participate, we invite you to visit northwestheat.org. You can also communicate with us through the poll that we will share at the end of this session. Before we introduce our presenters, we will take a moment to share some housekeeping details. This session includes a chat, which means you can submit questions to our presenters throughout the session. In addition to our presenter, Chennettée, we will also have a question moderator, Alice Swift. There will be a dedicated time for questions at the end of the presentation. This session includes captioning through AI Media. You will find instructions on how to access captioning in our Zoom chat. We also have ASL interpreters through virtual VRI. This session is being recorded and the video will be shared at northwestheat.org. And so our speakers today are Michele Joy Bromley, Manager of Digital Accessibility and Content in the Office of Information Technology at Portland State University, and Chennettée Jelleberg, Director of the Office for Student Access at the Oregon Health and Science University. And now we will turn it over to Michele and Chennettée for their presentation.
Thank you. Good morning, Northwesterners. As you heard, you are in the right place if you're here for Collaboration Creates Capacity. Once again, my name is Michele Bromley and my pronouns are she, her, hers. In addition to my work at Portland State University around digital accessibility, I am also a certified accessible document specialist and certified professional in accessibility core competencies and web accessibility. Chennettée?
Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Chennettée Jelleberg. It's going to be a morning. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And as Gloria said, I'm the director of the Office for Student Access, which is the student accommodation office at OHSU. I am also a certified rehabilitation counselor with a training in clinical rehabilitation counseling. So basically a clinical mental health counselor with a focus on working with folks with disabilities. And I'm very excited to be here today. Now, before we get started, we want to ensure that our webinar is as accessible as possible to all attendees. As was stated, there's ASL interpreting and captioning. We understand that everyone intakes and processes information differently. So visual presentations with potentially scattered narration may not quite be your way of learning. So we are also making sure our full slide deck, including all links and references, are available to you in an accessible HTML format. You can navigate to bit.ly/collaboration-slides with a plus sign at the end, and I'll have Michele add that to the chat as well. Or you can use the QR code on the screen. You are welcome to reference these materials during this webinar or keep them as a takeaway for reference for future study as well.
You may have noticed that the bit.ly link with a plus sign does not take you directly to the presentation slides. The addition of the plus sign is a security measure recommended by our IT security team. It allows end users to verify the link destination via an intermediary bit.ly landing page before proceeding. Since, as I'm sure y'all are aware, link shorteners are often used by cybersecurity criminals for phishing attempts. While we will have dedicated a time for questions at the end of the presentation, we welcome questions throughout and we will respond when feasible. If I see a question in the chat that is something we might be answering later in the presentation, we might wait for that one and get back to it when we get to question time at the end.
Okay, so the big question, should we be worried about the looming ADA Title II compliance deadline and the work we have in front of us to ensure the accessibility of not only our public-facing digital resources, but now our internal and academic resources as well? And the answer is probably, but at least we're in it together and we can collaborate together.
As Mary Lou Mobley shared in her presentation last year, and as Russ Poulin so eloquently summarized afterward, the path to compliance is the responsibility of everyone. There is too much to do. Distributed and siloed accessibility efforts are doomed to fail. We don't have the capacity individually, and we don't have the time or money to waste on redundancies. We have a much greater chance at achieving digital accessibility maturity at our respective institutions if we worry and work together. So things you've already covered in previous webinars on this topic. You already know the why. It's the law, and not just the spirit of the law anymore or something enforced by case law precedent only. More importantly, it's the right thing to do. We all know the statistics. The 1 in 4 adults in the US impacted by disabilities who may be excluded by our institutions' inaccessible digital resources. And the who? You know that too. It's you, me, everyone. Referring back to the summary of Mary Lou Mobley's presentation, I think we can all agree that we're past the point where we can pretend this is the responsibility of a siloed and beleaguered accommodations specialist in human resources, or an equally, if not more beleaguered team of accommodations specialists in disability services, which Chennettée can speak to directly.
Previous presentations have discussed the importance of this work being a shared responsibility. While my office, the Student Access Office, may have folks with the knowledge to make materials accessible, we often do not have the specific topic content expertise. At OHSU, we are a health sciences university. Staff in my office are not doctors, dentists, cancer researchers, etc. It's the same if you assign accessibility remediation work to department support staff. When it comes to alternative text, especially, the creators are the ones who best know what information is meant to be relayed by those images, by those digital materials. For instance, I may view an image of a cell under a microscope and start describing the specific shapes and colors when the image was meant to convey a specific cellular process that was occurring. Again, it's really important that we all work together when ensuring we're communicating the correct information.
All right, so jumping in. How do we collaborate, both internally and externally? How do we even get off the ground? You have to start by asking yourself, where are we right now? Before conceptualizing what it will take to get from point A to point Y, get it? Accessibility. Chennettée did not want me to use that joke. We need to determine your point of reference. You and other internal stakeholders need to assess your current level of digital accessibility maturity to figure out where your point A is. There are dozens, hundreds of digital accessibility maturity models out there. You are absolutely not starting from scratch. And you should likewise absolutely not reinvent the wheel. Start with something others have created as a baseline and tailor that model to your institutional needs. The Level Access Digital Accessibility Maturity Model, the World Wide Web Consortium's Accessibility Maturity Model, or WebAIM's Accessibility Maturity Model are great places to start. All three are linked in our references slides at the end of the presentation, which, as a reminder, is bit.ly/collaboration-slides. For today, we're going to go with the simplest of change management maturity models in the context of digital accessibility. So think about your point A. Are you not started, learning, responding, establishing, or optimizing? You're all here today, so I would say that puts most of you past the not started category, at minimum in the learning category, and you are already on your way to point B.
So now you need to determine your reference point for any digital accessibility maturity model. Doesn't happen in a vacuum. You have to ask yourself, who needs to be in the room? Who do you need in your corner? Who do you need to support this work? And really, who needs you in their corner? Because you all are here. I'm guessing you understand the importance of this. So folks need you and your passion for this as well. Decisions regarding which maturity model to use, determination of where your institution falls in that model, and all of the research that is needed in between require not only executive level sponsorship, but cross-departmental input and participation. So this may look like your disability services office, contracting and procurement, diversity and inclusion staff, distance learning and instructional design teams. Your IT office definitely needs to be part of this. University communications, academic affairs, library staff, technical staff, beyond. This is going to probably be a very large group of folks who need to be part of this conversation.
You want to think about who at your institution may have already done some work in this area, possibly even without having a direct connection to digital accessibility. Are there library staff at your institution who are already working with open educational resources? Are there IT teams who already have workflows for reviewing technology procurements for security and privacy? Building on those existing workflows and infusing accessibility into institutional processes that already exist is going to be one of your best bets for establishing digital accessibility growth. You want to create partnerships and build on what you have. Start there, iterate, and improve as needed. A very common and debilitating pitfall to digital accessibility maturity is redundancy. Siloed processes, standards, and resources create huge barriers to digital accessibility growth. The majority of higher education institutions do not have the bandwidth, the funding, or the expertise to take on this work alone in distributed and already exhausted packs of folks. So you want to make a list of those people, schedule a meeting, and invite everyone.
So what comes after that cross-development partnership building? Well, you need to come up with your shared goals and guidelines. So it's time to take an inventory on that as well. What guidelines do you already have in place? Are there any policies, content guidelines, communication guidelines, things like that? What about support pathways that already exist? Are there trainings? Are there resources to train folks about digital accessibility? How to create accessible digital content, but also how to remediate content that already exists? What about tools? Are there authoring tools that can help with this process? Are there any contracts with remediation vendors or software licenses? Really make sure you're digging down into what you already have.
You also need to have a really good idea of what tools make up your digital ecosystem. That's one of your first steps. Once you get the people in the room, now you have to establish an idea, a map of the tools that you have: websites, learning management system modules, portable document files, videos, audio, Microsoft content, Google Workspace content, any content project and service management platforms, customer relationship management systems. Your institution's digital footprint is likely much larger than you know, much larger than any one department would know, even your IT unit. Think about all of those click-through agreements and open source tools your faculty and staff have likely implemented and will continue to implement on a yearly basis. Start by engaging with those cross-departmental stakeholders to determine a baseline list of your most accessed digital resources and tools. These are the materials that are most likely to create critical engagement barriers for both internal and external end users. Barriers to engagement can lead to lost opportunities for recruitment, engagement, and retention. The academic and career success for your students, staff, and potential donors is inhibited when they're unable to engage with the most critical tools in your digital ecosystem. So you start with the people, you get all those minds together, you figure out what the tools are that you're going to start with.
So once you know where you are, you have to ask yourself, where do you want to be? Collectively establish a strategic plan for digital accessibility growth. And we'll dive into all of these accessibility roadmap focus points more in the next section of our presentation. But let's start with a brief overview. You can and should begin with a well-sponsored institutional policy and associated standards. But what are the focus points of both that documentation and your supporting framework? This should include design, the digital resources your faculty and staff are actively creating, procurement, the digital resources your faculty and staff are interested in purchasing and or implementing, and remediation, the inaccessible digital resources your faculty and staff have already implemented that are already available to your campus community. So you now have the right people in the room. You've chosen and adapted a digital accessibility maturity model. You've crafted at least draft policies and standards around the design, procurement, and remediation of your institution's digital resources. So what's next? Well, accessibility roadmap metrics. Measuring digital accessibility maturity, especially in a distributed design and procurement model like the ones we have at most of our institutions, can be tricky. This is why having the right people in the room is so critical. Here are some considerations to get started in that room. Think about internal versus external user impact. We are both working with our internal faculty, staff, students, but we're also working with recruiting those folks. We're working with getting more knowledge about what our institutions do, potentially recruiting donors or alumni to donate. We need to think about the total number of impacted users in general. How many folks do we reach with our different digital accessibility content? More than likely, again, it's much more than we could ever guess. And then connect to the institutional mission and goals. That can be a really great way of building buy-in and getting support for this work. There may be tools and resources that are exclusively created for internal or external end users. There are also many that are intended for both. And impact may include individual page views or actionable elements sections, recruitment and retention, like I said, academic completion metrics for students. Again, think about that retention rate. And if a student can't access their course content in an accessible way, what might that mean for them to not only stay in their program, but eventually complete it? What about alumni and donor interaction? Ensuring materials and tools are digitally accessible will also ultimately increase the total number of users reached. So again, thinking back to who is in your corner and what that means to your mission and goals. And likewise, tying technology impact to your institutional mission can be, again, that great way to get buy-in and get support.
Right. So where are we now? Where are we going? And now how do we get there? There is only one way, folks. As Chennettée shared in that last section, you'd need a well-sponsored institutional policy and associated standards, but it will mean nothing without a framework to support compliance. You have to build a sustainable framework for training, support, and assessment. Without it, policies and standards become relatively meaningless. So design, the stuff you create. How do we tackle design in our supporting framework? The answer is training, training, training. Capacity building for accessible design will almost always be more cost and time effective for sustained accessibility maturity. While you may need to outsource remediation of existing digital resources, more on that here in a minute, the only way to move toward a future where remediation becomes unnecessary is to train the faculty and staff who are creating digital resources to stop the flow of inaccessible implementation. Facilitate long-term sustainability for your digital accessibility framework by ensuring that those who are creating digital resources are given the tools to create with accessibility in mind. This is where it is critical that we note the differences between public-facing digital resources and internal digital resources, let alone the academic course materials in the latter category. And Chennettée spoke to this a bit earlier. When someone suggests making disability services or another individual department responsible for the conversion of all digital resources, we remind them of the very specific subject matter expertise required to design fully accessible digital materials for academic music programs, chemistry labs, art history materials, advanced math and statistics courses. Often a universal digital accessibility basics training and associated support materials for how to use accessible authoring tools and content management programs to generate accessible public-facing digital content will be sufficient for staff. But for faculty, there will likely need to be additional instructional design training, how to use accessible equation editors, for example, how to generate fully accessible slide presentations, or training on advanced long description for complex images and diagrams. The most effective, most competent, most efficient creators of accessible academic digital resources are the appropriately trained subject matter experts themselves. Thankfully, there is a wealth of accessible digital design support materials available online. It's often a matter of collaboratively curating. That's a tongue twister. Collaboratively curating those resources and making them available. Folks don't know where to start, and it can be extremely overwhelming when the topic of digital accessibility is first introduced, especially if you are a faculty member who has been generating academic course content for your entire career. And often what is heard when someone comes to them and talks about digital accessibility is, you're telling me I'm doing everything wrong and I have to relearn how to create all of my resources. So the most important thing is collecting the resources and pointing folks to the right place so that they don't feel lost. They don't feel up a creek without a paddle. This is not about completely overhauling the way that they create content. They're creating content using the tools they were already using, doing things a little bit differently. If they're creating their syllabi in Microsoft Word, they need to start thinking about alt text behind images in a tool in which they already have a substantial amount of expertise. They need to be thinking about element order in their PowerPoint or Google Slides. We're going to include some examples from the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative, from Web Accessibility in Mind, or WebAIM, in our additional resources slide. These websites all include invaluable training and how-to resources, including a literal roadmap to meeting the ADA Title II requirements from WebAIM, which I found after we wrote this presentation. It's an amazing resource. Procurement, the stuff you want to buy. Once again, this is where cross-departmental and team collaboration is incredibly key. You need to identify all parties involved in procurement. There's the purchasing department. That's a pretty wide category. Literally anyone on campus procuring any kind of technology or digital resource on behalf of the institution for implementation. The vendors from whom they're considering making a purchase, contracting and procurement, and your IT office. Your framework should set the groundwork for, number one, setting digital accessibility expectations with vendors. I'm going to say that one again. Number 1, setting digital accessibility expectations with vendors. Number 2, establishing workflows for accessibility documentation review. Number 3, assessing and or validating barriers through functional accessibility testing. And finally, making pathways for alternative workarounds or means of access in situations where remediation for identified barriers will take some time. You'll start to get really familiar, if you aren't already, with some new higher education alphabet soup or some old higher education alphabet soup that is just now becoming piping hot again. Voluntary product accessibility templates, or VPATs, and equally effective alternate access plans, or EEAAPs. Before we go into remediation, the stuff you already have, those 4 steps, setting expectations, establishing workflows, assessing or validating barriers, making pathways. For those of you who do not have experience reading a VPAT or generating an EEAAP or working with departments to do those things, we have some resources for you. This presentation is called Collaboration Creates Capacity. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. And I'm mentioning it now because often when we talk about accessible procurement, these 4 steps can feel really overwhelming. How do we set digital accessibility expectations with vendors? How do we establish workflows for documentation review? How do you even read a VPAT in such a way that gives you any real information about the technology when a lot of vendors don't necessarily understand the VPAT themselves and may answer those questions incorrectly? So we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. All right, remediation. The stuff you already have. This can be the scariest one, the one that triggers our collective neurodivergent demand avoidance, or at least it does for the 2 of us. Remediation is the laundry pile that feels too big to tackle. We often just want to give up and pull our outfits straight from the pile every morning. Unfortunately, not anymore. The DOJ has set a deadline, and it's time to find a friend, body double, and sort the laundry. Even if the DOJ itself does not enforce that April 2026 deadline, those updates to ADA Title II will be enforced by costly litigation. Level Access' most recent report on digital accessibility legislation, I think July 2024, over 1,000 lawsuits were filed in the US related to digital accessibility in Q1 of last year alone. Those lawsuits span the gamut from niche boutique businesses to most certainly higher education institutions. For design and procurement, you're looking ahead. How do we stem the flow of inaccessible implementation and ensure that we are working toward digital accessibility for our resources going forward? For remediation, you're looking behind, and that laundry pile is a lot. To put it in perspective, just PDFs alone, portable document files uploaded to either your public-facing website or your learning management system, these are covered under ADA Title II. I checked our own numbers yesterday. For Portland State University, that means over 4,000 PDFs on the public-facing website and over 1.5 million PDFs in the learning management system. In terms of remediation for any of those documents that might be inaccessible, that's more than any one department can handle. As an institution, you have 2 choices: do the work in-house or contract with a third party. Basically, you do it or you pay someone. Oh, or a third option, campaigns against digital hoarding. Do we need all that legacy content on our website or in our learning management system? Or is it time to donate some of that laundry? So during the work in-house, what does that involve? Training, similar kind of training you need to make available when tackling design. Luckily, there are substantial open source and community-driven how-to resources for retroactively remediating existing inaccessible digital resources. To be clear, the learning curve on this is high, and the work is substantially more difficult for remediation than it is for design. Using that PDF example, retroactively applying tag structure and repairing reading order in an inaccessible PDF is substantially harder than designing an accessible electronic document. Applying audio description to an already produced video recorded without conscientious narration of visual elements, hard, very hard. For HTML content and some content management platforms like Microsoft Office Suite, there are automated assessment tools available to give you a baseline. What are we looking at? What kind of repairs are necessary? But human validation is invariably required. Even the best automated accessibility evaluation tools will not catch all accessibility barriers.
And your other choice is contracting with a third party. Depending on both the bandwidth and capacity of your faculty and staff, centrally funded or pass-through costs remediation by a third-party accessibility business may be your most cost and time-effective option. Before making that determination, it's important to consider the subject matter of your digital resources and platforms. For those with specialized academic software and course materials, are there outsourcing platforms with the expertise to remediate that content? Again, using OHSU as an example, how many remediation platforms have the expertise to remediate complex health sciences content? So, if you are thinking about contracting with a third party, you need to do your research. There are several reputable consultancies out there. 3Play Media, Accessibility Oz, 247 documents, Census Access, to name a few, but you must consider all your options and which is best. So, what do we do next? Well, we collaborate, we share, and we support each other in this work, starting right now with this presentation and our resources forward. So, cross-institutional collaboration. All of us here are from a multitude of institutions. So we have another link to share with you, a shared Google Drive folder to which you all have viewing and contributing access. So navigate to bit.ly/A11Y-resource-sharing, or use the QR code on the screen. I'll also have Michele put that in the chat. We've gotten things started for you with some of our own institutional resources, design resources, incident response, procurement, program building, testing, and reporting. We want to support each other and share what you can. Use comments to ask questions about the resources you don't understand, because as we've said, and as this presentation is here, collaboration creates capacity. You are not in this alone. None of us are in this alone. And that capacity is at its greatest when we collaborate both within our institutions and across institutions.
Giving you a couple of examples of what you're going to see in that folder. And again, we just got it started for you, but this is our goal. Cross-institutional collaboration so that we have a whole pool of resources to bring to the stakeholders at our institutions. One of the things you'll see in there is a sample equally effective alternate access plan template that we use at Portland State University, including a supporting article that explains to purchasing departments how that EEAP works, a sample digital accessibility roadmap that we have purchasing departments share with vendors when vendors say, I don't know what you're talking about. What's a digital accessibility roadmap? How do we do that? A how-to document from start to finish of how it's a set of completion instructions that I created for my staff for how to read and evaluate a VPAT. That is a very specialized skill, and there's a lot of information in the metadata that often gets ignored when folks just look at the tables and see, the vendor says that they comply with every single success criterion. That's amazing. Most of the time, if someone says they've complied with every single WCAG success criteria in a VPAT, it means that they didn't actually understand what those are. And they probably didn't test with adaptive technology, which is something that you're going to be able to find in the metadata. These resources I owe to the dozens and dozens of institutions who have supported me in my career. The institutions that I collaborated with, I looked at, I don't even know, 17 different equally effective alternate access plans to create our first template, to figure out something that was going to work effectively for PSU. Looked at dozens of digital accessibility roadmaps. Having a place like this, which doesn't always have to be in a Google Drive folder, this is just something to start. Having somewhere where we can share and exchange information with each other and look at the resources that we've already been building on our own, and bringing things to the stakeholders at our institution to then decide how to put together something that's going to work best for your institution's needs. Alrighty. Time for questions. How can we support y'all?
And I'm going to stop sharing so I can also see the chat.
Excellent. And just a preview of, again, that the link for our slides is in the chat, the bit.ly/collaboration-slides with a plus sign. And what you'll see beyond the questions slide, or what you'll be able to engage with using your adaptive technology tools of choice, is an additional resources slide that has links to DQ University, the W3C's Web Accessibility Initiative, W3X Introduction to Web Accessibility course, which is a completely free edX course that you could utilize on your campus, and also Web Accessibility in Mind. Beyond that, there are 4 reference slides. There are 4 because we like to have a minimum font of 24 point when we're creating a presentation to be as accessible as possible. But those reference slides are going to include links to anything that we shared source-wise throughout the presentation. Alrighty, seeing some questions in the chat. Do you have suggestions for auditing, measuring, reviewing, etc., compliance for course content within an LMS? Ooh, it's a complicated question because the answer is, how much money do you have? It's a lot. Your learning management system, the example that I used earlier with PDFs, your learning management system is going to contain substantially more individual digital assets than your public-facing website. You've got the HTML content within the course models, but the amount of uploaded digital assets, videos and images and PDFs, you're talking about a substantial amount of content. That auditing those materials is made substantially easier by starting with a quality automated tool. Those can be really expensive. Blackboard Ally is a great example by Anthology, similar to Site Improve is a great example of a tool for a non-LMS space, like a public-facing website. Those tools are just a starting point. They're more of a way of quickly gathering inventory. You can also, a harder pathway, but a possible pathway, is working with your IT office, your LMS admins, to get kind of an overarching idea. All right, this is what we're starting with. We're starting with X number of PDFs. We're starting with X number of videos. Those can be helpful large numbers to bring in high-level stakeholders and say, okay, like, we need some central funding for some overarching auditing tools. If you don't have an overarching auditing tool that can pull those resources and run an automated checker, then your baseline, finding out how many PDFs you've got, downloading them either en masse or per course. And there are automated accessibility assessment tools within each content authoring program. So Microsoft PowerPoint, Microsoft Office, Adobe Acrobat Pro. So you can run those tests on an individual document. Again, As we shared about automated tests earlier, that's your baseline. That's going to catch the most egregious of things, probably about 60% of your accessibility issues. And really, that's when that distributed training model is most important. Getting top-down, high-level stakeholder support saying, hey, we've got a problem. We've got X number of things in our system. We're going to have a mandatory required training, paid mandatory training for all of our faculty and academic staff and our instructional designers. And then we're going to have a distributed auditing model. So download all of your stuff, review it using these tools, make a plan for how you're going to repair that content and move forward. All of that is going to be time intensive, and there's either going to need to be a lot of top level sponsorship to enforce that compliance, or top level funding for those overarching tools. All right, that was a long answer. I apologize. Chennettée, do you want to take the next one? Let me see. Do historical PDFs that are no longer actively used require remediation beyond adding a disclaimer?
It depends. So when you're talking about actively used, is it just living in the LMS system and somebody could come across it and still find ways to use it? Is it just sitting in a or is it just sitting in like somebody's office OneDrive and probably never going to be used again? It's really thinking about what is it going to be accessed for, even if it's not being actively used. I think that's where that comes in, that discussion of go through, let's stop hoarding PDFs and documents that we're not using anymore. If you're not actively using it, if it's only being kept as a historical, maybe there might be a request for what I often think about is our office handbook, our student accommodations handbook. We keep every version of it in case there are, complaints or questions that come up that are historical and we need to reference, but that is kept within our office and nobody else outside of our office uses it. I like to say we have made them accessible in general, but things like that aren't available to a wider public, you don't need to worry about that as much. But again, it's a good time to start going through and doing spring cleaning of your documents and your digital content, and really thinking about, why are you keeping things? Is there a reason to keep it? And there are, as academic institutions, we have record retention responsibilities. But again, really thinking about, why are you keeping it? And if there's the possibility that it may be accessed, especially by students or things like that, even if you put a historical marker on it, if it could be referenced again as a learning material, you're going to want to make it accessible.
Yeah, and I would add the disclaimer that I know you're all already aware of, that we are not lawyers. So my strongest recommendation regarding legacy content would be to reference the letter of the ADA Section 504 Title II updates. There is some limited but still existing information in the text regarding legacy content and what expectations the DOJ has for legacy content. As Chennettée shared, and I will emphasize again, just a huge barrier to accessibility growth and maturity is the problem that we have in higher education with digital hoarding. So historical PDFs that are no longer actively used, the short answer, with the I am not a lawyer caveat, is that I would say they don't require remediation. They should be taken down. They should be put into storage, archived for historical reference, and if at any point they are needed again, they can be pulled out and remediated. Let's see, the next question, how to balance legal and copyright restrictions with accessibility. Joanna, I do not want to call you out if you are uncomfortable with it, but if you are comfortable, can I get some clarification regarding maybe a a use case or an example where this has come up for you, possibly with captioning?
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I'm just, some of the PDFs that I make are delivered in a way that they can't be downloaded or printed, and that's a copyright, policy restriction. And normally, if somebody encountered something like that, that needed more accessibility function, that they would be directed to our Disability Access Center, where they would presumably already be registered and already be in that program to get fully, accessible material. And it sounds like just doing some kind of disclaimer or redirect like that isn't going to work anymore. So I'm kind of weighing, does that mean we can no longer provide those materials if we can't make them more fully accessible? If we have to, if anything has like a restriction, otherwise, like whether it's time or, copyright, other kind of legal or technical restrictions, it sounds like that means that I just am not going to be able to make that available under those restrictions anymore.
So as of my understanding of the April 2026 deadline, is that materials need to be proactively accessible to meet the ADA going forward. And there are, as we discussed, some specific exceptions for legacy content or some leeway with legacy content. I think it's something that I think Chennettée and I have both heard from faculty a lot in trainings over the years, when folks say, well, am I not able to share it if I can't make it accessible? And my counsel in that scenario would be, again, to either make it accessible in-house or to send it out for remediation. Because the short answer to the question of, is a disclaimer going to be fine? And then we refer them to someone else. And again, disclaimer, I'm not a lawyer, but in my understanding, that is not going to meet ADA Title II. In my understanding, it already doesn't meet ADA Title II before the DOJ's ruling for public-facing content, because it's not considered equitable access, because a member of the public who does not require the use of adaptive technology, for example, may engage with the PDF right now at 11:49 a.m. But somebody who does use adaptive technology, screen reading software, speech recognition, they can't engage with it at 11:49 a.m. If the disclaimer is accessible, they see or read the disclaimer using their adaptive technology. They reach out to an associated accommodations office. They work with them to get an alternative. Depending on the complexity of the document, it may take some time to remediate. Often disability services are going to need to work with respective departments to get access to an unlocked version of the PDF so that they can go through that remediation. And that's not going to be considered equitable access under the ADA. My counsel is always to, that the answer is not that we can't share it, but to work with the tools available to you. With Adobe Acrobat Pro, it's not that it's not difficult work, but with Adobe Acrobat Pro, I can take a PDF that already exists in an inaccessible format, and I can go in and I can retroactively tag it. Of course, the more accessible, sustainable, long-term option is to be creating it in an accessible authoring program like Microsoft Word, for example, and then exporting using the appropriate procedures to ensure it's a tagged PDF. But I'm not sure about the connection to copyright restrictions. Yeah,
If
go
it's
ahead,
like an
Chennettée.
outside resource, so like a
Yeah.
No, this is in-house. We're talking,
Oh.
I'm using the content management system. It's being posted on Canvas basically, but I'm making PDFs in-house that are starting out accessible, but the way some of them are displayed, it's a system called controlled digital lending. And so the best practices for that are that those are not downloadable or printable. And so, it takes away, it's not an open PDF at that point. The person who is reading those isn't able to download them themselves or do any remediation. And that is part of the policy for making those available in that limited form is that they have to have those restrictions. And so I was just curious for something it's a pretty limited use, but it's just something that I'm trying to kind of sort out a workflow for.
Yeah, and I think that would be, if there's restrictions on how that documentation is shared, that might be one of those situations where you're going to want to talk to your in-house general counsel, because the difficulty there, and again, this is just my personal experience, but as the alternative formats coordinator for the Digital Disability Resource Center at Portland State, there were very few situations, if any, where accessibility law didn't overcome those kind of restrictions. And what I mean by that is understanding that documentation needs to be locked down. It's a question of, let's talk about the accessibility of those rules. If there is a rule and restriction on campus that something is locked down, but that rule then creates an accessibility barrier for people, because it being locked down allows access to people who don't use adaptive technology, but doesn't allow access to people who do, which is going to be a problem with ADA Title II and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So definitely something worth discussing with your Office of General Counsel.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you, Joanna. Let's see, Beth, thoughts on pushing faculty for full compliance for course content versus a more phased approach? By X date, all videos have audio, for example, by X date, all videos have auto-generated captions. By Y date, all videos have manually reviewed captions. By Z date, all videos have captions and audio descriptions. I love a phased approach. Absolutely. Any digital accessibility roadmap, yeah, when we use the phrase digital accessibility roadmap earlier, we were talking about templates to share with vendors. But when you're working on creating your own digital accessibility roadmap, just like having a policy without training is not going to be very effective. Having training without like that support framework is also not going to be super effective. I've seen so many institutions say, okay, we got our policy. We're going to bring in like an outside trainer, get a big name from UW and bring somebody in and do a big training, and everybody's trained. Go forth and make all of your content accessible by this day. Oof, that is a lot. And as I said, collaboration makes capacity. So having open labs for people to work on these things together, like, all right, we are going to have a series of open labs for accessible syllabus design. We're booking a computer lab. Everybody come. We're going to have the tools projected on screen and we're all going to work on this together. Absolutely having a phased approach. One of the biggest things is prioritizing current and future content above past content. It's really two different strategies. Thinking about remediating your content, that's when people get stuck. And there's not any accessibility growth because they're looking at that mountain. So saying, okay, like, we're going to talk about a plan for remediation. We're going to talk about it as a group. We're going to figure out what we're going to do. We're going to figure out what kind of funding we have. But in terms of what we're creating right now and moving forward, let's make a big push on these aspects and those aspects. Setting a couple of major baselines though for all content, saying we're not going to publish any more videos unless they're captioned, and these are the tools for captioning. Saying we're not going to put any more images up unless we put alt text in, and here's a link to the instructions for alt text, for putting alt text in Canvas, in Blackboard, in Moodle, in Microsoft PowerPoint, in Google Slides. And those resources already exist out there, the how-tos for each of those. It's a matter of collating and pulling that content and making it available to your folks. I often start with the big three, in my opinion. heading structure, alternative text, and descriptive links. So getting rid of your totally unnavigable digital content because there's no heading structure, ensuring that all of your images have alternative text, and ensuring that we purge our digital resources of the click here's and the more informations and the learn mores and the read mores, which are so very inaccessible.
I think a
see.
big thing that has also been helpful with, that stage design, but also that proactive, is having folks who are part of your LMS team be in your corner. And so I think one of the things that has been very helpful, at least at OHSU, I think Justy might even be on this call. Thought I saw her name, but we have, somebody focused on digital accessibility in our teaching and learning center and works closely with faculty as they're developing new content. And so Justy has been really helpful with building those relationships and collaboration as new content is being created as well. And that is super helpful, again, to have folks who are part of building that be the champions of accessibility as well.
So I think since we're running out of time here, let's just do one last question. Braith has a question. I know there's a lot of strategies for convincing vendors to up their accessibility via contracts, but we don't seem to have much negotiating power. Are we now at a point where if a vendor can't or won't comply with ADA, WCAG requirements, we cannot renew that resource? Thinking about journals / databases, etc. This is where getting your stakeholders in the room, that very first step. Where are we now? Getting the right people in the room and getting that top level sponsorship is really critical, because if you don't have top level sponsorship from your executive council, from your provost to say, yeah, no, we're not moving forward with this. This VPAT shows that people who are deaf and hard of hearing, people who are deaf blind have zero access to this user interface. Or let's see, one of the worst things I've seen with a lot of programs is that a huge amount of work has been made within the body of a user interface or a software to be accessible via screen reading software, but the ability to log in, the login piece is not accessible. And the alternative workaround captured on a VPAT is human assistance. So every time someone wants to use this tool, they are unable to use it independently. If you don't have top level sponsorship, then yeah, you can't say no, which is a really difficult place to be. It's one of the reasons why one of the resources you're going to see in there is I created a draft level, a draft template for setting accessibility expectations at whatever level your executive sponsorship will allow. So this is establishing accessibility expectations in an informal email exchange. This is establishing it via an accepted backed statement on behalf of your university. This is establishing it in standard RFP language, which it would be great if you could get that infused into your standard RFP and RFQ language with your contracts office. And then finally, here's some recommended contract language. So starting where you can and building to that level where, yep, now it's in all of our contract language and we have the power to say no.
And we are at noon. Again, we're here. If you have questions, it's all about collaboration. Please use the resources and connect with each other. This is not something we have to do alone.